Queen Marika the Eternal did not simply guard the Golden Order, she broke it. The central fact of her rule is deliberate. Marika shattered the Elden Ring and then recast the world's source of authority into a tight, centralized system under her control. That choice didn't secure peace. It concentrated power, erased older balances, and opened a lasting contest over the pieces she left behind. The game's lore entries, item descriptions, and NPC testimony record the steps of this transformation. They chronicle royal decrees, institutional reforms, and punitive campaigns that replace distributed sources of influence with one official doctrine. Those fragments show a consistent pattern: the removal of plural checks on power, the legalization of succession through divine sanction, and the punishment of rivals or anomalies who resisted the new order. The consequences are visible in broken alliances, repeated wars for claimants, and the social dislocation that follows each new attempt to reclaim or redefine the ring. Put plainly, Eternal names a policy, not peace. Marika's actions engineered cycles of authority and conflict that outlived her reign, and those cycles are the real cost of her so-called salvation. Marika's public legend is simple and relentless. She was chosen by the greater will, and by her rule the world was set right. Every monument, every shrine, every official proclamation in the lands between repeats that claim. Stone reliefs, the Erdtree's groves, royal seals, and the ritual language used by priests and soldiers present Marika not just as a successful monarch, but as the living executor of a cosmic mandate. The epithet, the Eternal, is treated as literal proof that her reign brought stability where there had been chaos. That presentation matters because it converts a claim about legitimacy into a set of practical instruments for governing. The Golden Order is more than an ideology in the game's world. It is shown as the institutional backbone that holds society together. Runes, sanctified decrees, and consecration rites are depicted as the actual mechanisms by which authority is recognized and passed on. The two fingers and the clerical offices that serve the Erdtree function as the interpreters of the greater will, Marika stands at the center of that interpretive machinery. In public records, memorial inscriptions, and the way ceremonies are staged beneath the Erdtree, the same message repeats. Marika's rule remedied prior disorder, and the Golden Order is the concrete form of that remedy. The everyday language of the lands between reinforces this portrait. Characters speak of the age of the Erdtree and the sanctity of the order in reverent terms. Palaces, shrines, and public works carry her motifs like official signage, visible evidence of a state that builds legitimacy through permanent markers. The allocation of land, the granting of titles, and the bestowal of sanctified weapons are depicted as routing through the order, as if it were a neutral administrative engine rather than a faction with interests. Laws are described as consecrated, rulership as ordained, and succession as something certified by celestial administration rather than the product of politics. That lexical choice matters. It frames political outcomes as the inevitable effect of a higher will rather than the result of human decisions. Item descriptions and fragmentary lore do the same work on a smaller scale. Great runes, consecration rituals, and relics linked to Marika are presented as components of a cosmic constitution, practical tools for holding power. The texts that describe these objects favor continuity and sacred legitimacy. They embed political authority in artifacts and procedures, so that whoever controls the runes and rites appears to control not only territory, but the moral universe. Reduce political power to relics and rituals, and you make it easier to claim that those who possess them are the rightful rulers. The game's flavor text repeatedly privileges that continuity. It describes succession in terms of restoration and rightness, not competition. Ceremony amplifies the message. Public celebrations beneath the Erdtree, the visible presence of clergy and formal consecration rituals stage authority as spectacle. These are not mere pageantry. They are deliberate acts of statecraft that manufacture consent. Repeated each generation, the rites train communities to read the political order as part of the world's enduring structure, not as one arrangement among many. Rituals shape behavior and expectations. When the populace has been taught to equate sanctified performance with legitimate rule, opposition begins to look like sacrilege. That fusion of religion and bureaucracy has built-in political consequences. If authority is validated by divine sanction, contests for power become framed as spiritual crimes rather than political disputes. The official narrative delegitimizes rivals by labeling them heretical or rebellious against the greater will. Monuments, sacred language, and institutional rituals all work together to make that delegitimization feel inevitable. In practice, dispute resolution, succession, and social standing are centralized around the Golden Order's tools, runes, rites, and clerical authority, so that political advantage accrues to those who control the Order's apparatus. Reading the world through its public legend explains a lot. Why the Erd Tree dominates the landscape, why factions strive to possess great runes, and why so many social arrangements point back to the Golden Order. But that official portrait also obscures crucial questions. It hides who benefited most from the system, which conflicts were smoothed over by ritual language, and how much of the Order's power rested on human institutions rather than divine mandate. In short, Marika's image as chosen and eternal is not merely a descriptive record, it is a manufactured identity policy dressed as providence. The title, The Eternal, functions as a political claim supported by symbols, ceremonies, and bureaucratic practices, and those supports are precisely what conceal the deeper tensions and motives behind the Order they legitimize. The Shattering is often told as a single catastrophic moment, the Elden Ring broken, the Erd Tree's light fractured, demigods thrown into ruinous war. The important correction is that the break is not presented as a random natural disaster or solely the result of outside tampering. Remembrances, inscriptions, and item texts repeatedly link the event to Marika, and they pair that link with a second, specific act. The removal of the Rune of Death. Those two facts recast the Shattering from accident to engineered rupture with immediate political consequences. Start with the chain the lore gives. The Elden Ring embodied the world's order. When it was broken its constituent, great runes were dispersed. Those great runes confer power and legitimacy. After the break, each demigod who held a great rune could claim authority in their domain, and most fought to expand it. The texts frame the ring's breaking and the scattering of great runes as cause and effect, and they explicitly tie the breaking to Marika's hand. The implication is not that she was merely a victim of war, but that she instigated a physical and therefore political fracture of the realm's central framework. The removal of the Rune of Death is the second, more damning piece of evidence. Multiple sources describe how during Marika's reign, death was taken from the world, no longer a guaranteed endpoint for certain beings. That was not an incidental miracle. It was a targeted alteration of cosmic law that produced a cohort of effectively immortal demigods whose conflicts no longer ended in natural death. Pair that deliberate excision with the dismantling of the Elden Ring, and the result looks like planned restructuring. Concentrate power into quasi-immortal beings, then fragment the mechanism that legitimizes rule so those beings must assert dominance to claim authority. Timing matters. The removal of the Rune of Death is linked to the period when the Elden Ring was fractured or immediately thereafter, and the political fallout follows fast. Once the ring's wholeness was destroyed and great runes existed as discrete marks of legitimacy, rival heirs and offspring set themselves up as competing sovereigns. The landscape fortified keeps held by demigods, great runes embedded in powerful champions, armies raised around single-family lines, reads like the aftermath of an engineered succession crisis. With death taken away for those who hold power, and legitimacy now parcelable, there was both motive and mechanism for prolonged escalating conflict. It's difficult to call the mass demigod warfare pure chaos when the structural incentives for war were installed alongside the ring's break. Some in-universe voices cast the Shattering as divine wrath or the inevitable collapse of cosmic balance. That framing serves a political function. It makes rebellion against the Golden Order appear heretical and masks the names and decisions behind the rupture. But surviving texts, the remembrances, great rune inscriptions, and histories tied to Marika do not leave this as ambiguous coincidence. Destroying an artifact as central as the Elden Ring and excising a fundamental rune are interventions that require agency and calculation, not mere accident. There are plausible alternative readings. Some argue Marika's actions were revolt against the greater will, an attempt to free the world from preordained pattern, a revolutionary rather than opportunistic project. That interpretation has weight. Marika's conflict with the greater will is referenced elsewhere. Still, it does not erase the practical result. Power concentrated into quasi-immortal claimants and legitimacy transformed into transferable objects. Whether Marika intended the ensuing violence as a price worth paying for freedom or as a calculated means to remake succession, the structural facts remain the same. Taken together, the evidence points toward a purposeful rupture. The Shattering was not simply an external calamity that befell the realm. It followed decisions that altered the rules of legitimacy and mortality. Those decisions rewrote succession and elevated certain lineages into quasi-immortal claimants. Once great runes existed as transferable marks of authority, the stage was set for protracted demigod conflict. The upshot is decisive. This was a political act with cosmic means. Marika broke the order, and breaking it reshaped power in ways that ensured civil war rather than restored balance. That conclusion sets the ground for the next question: how Marika's family ties and marriages turned those engineered ruptures into actual instruments of rule. Marika used marriage and parentage like state instruments. Her unions weren't private. They were how she extended, folded, and defended the Golden Order's authority across the realm. Radagon's arrival at court makes that obvious. He did not simply switch households, he arrived with an existing political identity. Before becoming Marika's consort and the second Elden Lord, Radagon was married to Rennala, the Queen of Caria. Rennala's grief and Ranni's bitterness are recorded in dialogue and faction lore. Those reactions are cast as political ruptures, not mere family drama. By marrying Radagon, Marika didn't just gain a powerful ally, she absorbed a living link to Caria's dynasty, its magic, and the loyalties attached to it. The marriage folded Carian authority into the Golden Order's orbit. The partnership between Marika and Radagon goes beyond tidy alliance building. Many texts describe Radagon as both Marika's consort and, in spiritual terms, a male aspect of the same sovereign, two bodies bearing a single authority. Whether that is literal theology or symbolic rhetoric is debated among interpreters, but the operational consequence is clear. The court treated sovereignty as something that could be shared, mirrored, and redistributed across persons. That arrangement made succession intentionally flexible and legally slippery. If the source of rule could manifest as more than one person, legitimacy could be projected onto different heirs, defended through multiple channels, and reassigned to suit political needs. Children in this system were not just heirs, they were living tokens of state power. The court produced a generation of demigods who carried divine favor and, in many cases, great runes or equivalent marks of authority. Figures repeatedly connected to Marika and Radagon, Godwyn the Golden, the twins Melania and Miquella, Morgoth, among others, serve as examples of how bloodlines and artifacts were married to create claims. These demigods were positioned in titles, commands, and regions in ways that tied family lineage to tangible levers of rule. Two structural features made that approach volatile. First, the instruments of sovereignty, the great runes and their kin, were transferable. They could be granted, stolen, removed, or contested. That stands in contrast to a simple hereditary throne that passes by clear descent. Second, Marika's practice of overlapping claims, where one person's legitimacy might stem from birth, a bestowed rune, alliance through marriage, or association with a sovereign who could split into multiple aspects, created multiple competing bases for the same office. Those bases were not reconciled into a single line of succession. They were tools and weapons in a court where legitimacy itself became fungible. Those mechanisms show up in concrete political consequences. Radagon's departure from Rennala left Ranni politically homeless and radicalized. Her rejection of the Golden Order is framed as a response to a court that treated lineage and identity as manipulable instruments. Godwyn's death, tied narratively to the removal or tampering of the Rune of Death, did not resolve into private mourning, but became a public fault line that other claimants could exploit. Demigods who should have inherited orderly authority instead found themselves contesting fragments of sovereignty, rivalries that escalated into open war. Marika also reworked the legal and metaphysical framework around mortality and succession, which amplified the stakes of marriage and childbearing. By altering runic lore and the rules that governed death and inheritance, the court created strong incentives to arrange marriages that secured alliances, to produce offspring who could be given runes, and to place those offspring in positions of strategic value. From a cold political perspective, those moves are textbook consolidation. Absorb other houses, align loyalties through marriage, and anchor power in heirs who bear recognized tokens of legitimacy. In Marika's case, that strategy was intensified by divine intervention and by institutions that made life, death, and authority convertible commodities. Viewed together, the pattern is not accidental. Marika weaponized intimate bonds, spouses, children, and overlapping identities to restructure how legitimacy operated in the world. Those bonds functioned less as personal ties and more as mechanisms of governance. They determined who could claim the Elden Ring's power, how claims could be defended, and which alliances would matter. The inevitable result was a political landscape of overlapping contestable claims where family ties were the primary battleground for cosmic authority. That engineered succession, treated as policy rather than lineage, set the conditions that made the Shattering and the Demigod Wars all but unavoidable. Queen Marika the Eternal and the Golden Order turned life and death into tools of rule. In Elden Ring's lore, the Elden Ring and its great runes were not mere symbols. They became the legal instruments that defined sovereignty. possession of runes and ceremonial recognition were treated as the core markers of legitimate authority, and bloodlines, childbirth, and dynastic rights were managed as state policy. That redefinition altered how power was produced and defended, with predictable and often brutal consequences. Game texts imply Marika removed or sequestered the Rune of Death from the ring. Practically, that meant death stopped functioning as a regular check on political claims. Instead of resolving rivalries by ending lines, mortality could be delayed or manipulated. Framed as a mercy or a means to preserve stability, this change removed an ultimate arbiter of succession. When rulers and heirs could be kept beyond ordinary lifespans, disputes that once closed naturally were allowed to persist and intensify across generations. With mortality subject to policy, life itself was allocated for political ends. Noble houses were pressured to produce heirs who could inherit or host great runes. Marriages were arranged to consolidate claims, children were elevated into offices or treated as vessels of legitimacy. These practices were sanctified by the Golden Order's language and ritual, but their function was consolidation. Concentrate fragments of the ring in chosen lines, manufacture visible continuity to deter rivals, and bind ordinary people's fate to a narrow elite's divine authority. When the Elden Ring shattered, that engineered architecture snapped. The shattering did not create conflict so much as expose a brittle system built on rune possession and ritual legitimacy. With great runes scattered, competing demigods, near divine claimants backed by armies and artifacts, went to war. Those fights were not abstract succession disputes, but catastrophic campaigns between beings whose status and power were materially tied to what the Order had made valuable. Territories were devastated, institutions toppled, and family networks turned into battlefronts. Ordinary people bore a quieter, cumulative toll. With sanctified office and delayed death accruing to favored lines, social mobility and generational renewal frayed. Estates and towns stagnated under semi-permanent rulers. Economies that depended on turnover ossified. Agricultural and civic labor was diverted to war and ceremonial duty. Cultural deference to the Erd Tree and the Order discouraged dissent and local initiative, so promises of peace and continuity often translated into scarcity, displacement, and erosion of customary rights for those outside the favored circles. There were also explicit household costs. In-game notes describe arranged unions, coerced placements, and the ritual deployment of offspring as containers for great runes. Children became political assets, families were reshaped by state needs. These practices generated deep resentments and factional tensions that later erupted once the ring broke. Framed as necessary for the realm's survival, they nonetheless subordinated human welfare to metaphysical stability. Institutionalizing engineered permanence introduced systemic fragility. Secrets kept to protect sanctity, such as concealing the consequences of removing the Rune of Death or hiding the ring's true origins, meant failure modes were suppressed rather than planned for. The fewer constraints on who could hold sustained power and the more inconvenient truths were buried, the less resilient the polity became to shock. The shattering was therefore not only a rupture of authority, but the moment a deliberately brittle architecture failed catastrophically, revealing the human and environmental damage of prioritizing permanence over adaptability. Marika's epithet, the eternal, captures that double edge: preservation and the cessation of decay on one hand, ongoing sacrifice and coercion on the other. The Golden Order concentrated sanctity into tokens and people, weaponized mortality into statecraft, and suppressed truths in the name of stability, measures that made demigod conflict more likely and ordinary life more precarious. Whether those decisions sprang from sincere religious conviction, a hunger for control, or desperate pragmatism is unclear in the records. The ambiguity is part of why her reign remains a moral puzzle rather than a simple triumph or atrocity. 3 plausible explanations account for why Marika created the Golden Order and then hardened it into a coercive system: genuine obedience to the greater will, a drive to centralize power, or a technocratic desperation to fix mortality. Each is supported by fragments of lore and NPC testimony, and read together they form a composite portrait rather than a neat moral label. Start with faith. Marika's public identity is bound to the greater will. The Erd Tree's imagery, the language of the runes, and the rites performed in her name present her as the visible executor of a cosmic mandate. Item descriptions and sermons frame the shape of law and order in the lands between as a fulfillment of that will. Her anointment reads less like a secular coup than the instantiation of theology as polity. From this angle, rearranging runes and building eternity look like religious work, efforts to align the world with an ideal order. Supporters and many artifacts treat her act as sacral. Marika is not merely ruling, she is making doctrine into structure. Faith explains why sanctity and permanence mattered to her, but it does not explain secrecy or coercion. A steward, truly acting only on divine instruction, would plausibly be more open about costs or at least distribute risk across institutions. Instead, the Golden Order funneled authority into decrees, tokens, and a narrow class of officials. The removal or modification of runes, most notably the implication of tampering with the Rune of Death, appears not as communal reform, but as unilateral metaphysical engineering that looks less like pious sacrifice and more like doctrine weaponized into law. Which brings us to power. Marika's arrangements produced mechanisms that are easy to govern from the center. Demigod succession, allocation of runes, and policing of knowledge concentrated supernatural authority in dynastic hands. Whoever controls the tokens controls succession, inheritance, and the mechanisms of life itself. The demigod wars that followed are partly a predictable consequence of that concentration. Institutional secrecy, burying the truth about death or hiding what breaking the Elden Ring would mean, matches an authoritarian pattern: hide inconvenient truths to prevent dissent. NPC lines and item lore about hidden rights, sanctioned silences, and punished curiosity reinforce the impression of deliberate centralization. But there is also evidence of desperation. Several texts and dialogues imply that the Golden Order included earnest attempts to cure the world's ills, most visibly the meddling with death. Removing the Rune of Death can plausibly be read as an effort to spare people from mortality's cruelties, to end incessant loss and create a polity that would not be undone by decay. Certain NPCs and flavor texts humanize these measures. Not every initiative reads like cold calculus. Some scholars portrayed Within the Lands Between interpret Marika's reforms as emergency interventions against a fracturing reality. If so, many harms become tragic side effects of policies born from existential fear rather than naked malice. The three motives work together. Faith supplied the moral vocabulary. The desire for control supplied the tools. Desperation supplied the urgency. If the world is sacred and fragile, then drastic curations can be presented as necessary. A sovereign terrified of entropy might accept coercion and secrecy as the price of permanence. Thus, doctrinal certainty could legitimize political monopoly enacted under the pressure of crisis. The Golden Order's logic becomes hybrid. Theology justifying monopoly, monopoly executed in the name of survival. Different characters emphasize different facets. Rani frames the Order as dogmatic tyranny. Her rebellion is framed explicitly as an escape from a predetermined cosmology. Priests and loyalists, by contrast, present Marika's rule as stabilizing sacral craft, and fragments about the removal of death or the concealment of the ring's origins provide motives that are at once idealistic and damning. When cosmic stability is the highest good, crushing dissent and redesigning life can be rationalized. The moral upshot is uncomfortable but clarifying. Read only as piety. Marika is a zealot whose faith justified immense harm. Read only as power-seeking. She is an architect of oppression who weaponized sanctity. The more defensible reading is composite, a sovereign acting from genuine religious conviction backed by a hunger for centralized order and driven by a pragmatic desire to stave off collapse. That blend explains why many characters attribute sincerity to her while the mechanics of her regime produce brittle institutions, sanctified ceremonies and a courtly order on one hand, suppressed information, fragile succession, and social architectures that punished adaptation on the other. Marika's eternal program reshaped the lands between at the cost of freedom, life, and resilience. The darkness at the center of her reign is not a simple corruption of power, but the outcome of faith, design, and fear fused into policy, a truth that demands a complex moral reckoning rather than a single verdict. Queen Marika's epithet, the Eternal, is not merely honorific, it conceals a deliberate program of remaking. By sacralizing rule, hiding the ring's origins, and removing death as a structural check, she concentrated power into brittle institutions that preserved order at the cost of lives, freedom, and resilience. The simple choices, zealot or tyrant, miss the point. Marika combined genuine cosmological conviction with pragmatic centralization, and that mixture produced oppression as a predictable outcome. That reinterpretation matters because it recasts rituals, relics, and fractures as policy outcomes rather than accidental byproducts. For players and lore hunters, the questions left open are tangible. Who wrote the concealments, which alternatives were erased, and how intentional was the human cost? Pursuing those answers is the clearest way to measure the true cost of Marika's eternity.